Hey guys, Mr. Bostic here. Welcome back to Medieval History. It's about time for us to get down to some review for Chapter 10, Medieval Learning and Art. And this time we get to talk about schools, by which I mean both grammar and university, as well as scholasticism, the premier philosophy of the Middle Ages, and architecture. So let's go ahead and get started. All right. Now, when we're dealing with the grammar schools, I mean, maybe the first question is, why are we calling them grammar? Well, as you probably know from your study of language, grammar is the first thing in many ways that you have to learn, except for maybe a few cut and paste phrases. You got to learn what the rules of the road are when dealing with a language, and it's true really with any field of study. You have to learn the basics, right? So, grammar represents those basics, and also in a literal sense, because remember, most of these students wouldn't have been speaking Latin, at least not exactly at home, but the language of scholarship was uniformly Latin. So after doing a little preliminary work, they would be needing to learn enough Latin so they could actually begin to study. And that's what the first step of any kind of grammar school would be for young students. We're talking about around 7 years old. They would progress from grammar, as we'll talk about in a second, throughout the liberal arts. But that's the first step, right? And so this is really a primary school, as we would call it today, doing the primary work of education, right? Not, I mean, in many ways very different, but in other ways quite recognizable, right? It's important to realize, of course, unlike our day, most kids weren't students. Most kids would grow up in their home. They might be apprenticed in a trade. They might, for the children of nobles, they would be trained as a knight, as we've already discussed. But for some who showed promise, and some from all classes, principally those who wanted to train to be a priest or cleric or a clerk, those words are equivalent, and also others, sometimes sons of noblemen, who the book. There's a tendency to kind of dismiss the scholarship that you'll see both in grammar schools. They mostly wouldn't have gone to grammar schools, but in universities as well, from the sons of noblemen. But not all of them were just dilettantes hanging around the university for the sake of the ambiance. It was maybe a different sort of thing was expected from them because they weren't expected to become a priest, right? But scholarship was open to other people as well, right? Excuse me. The real nuts and bolts of education, however, and this is for grammar schools and really for universities as well, in the foundational level, are the seven liberal arts. And when you hear the word liberal today, we tend to think of a political term. It's not, at least not foundationally. It means free, right? These are the arts of training for a free man, and they come from the classical world. In the classical world, it was illegal to teach these kinds of things to slaves. And there were lots of slaves in the ancient world. There still were slaves here in the medieval period, but not many. And serfs, of course, were busy farming. They weren't receiving education by and large. But these are the arts of the free man. Why? Because they free the mind. They're the kind of thing that is free from practical necessity. Slaves were able to learn the practical arts in the ancient world, but they weren't able to learn the refined, independent thought sort of arts that are essential really to a true education. And so those start with a trivium, three ways. That's what trivium means: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. These are the foundations, as we said in the grammar. The learning how to think and put things together in a meaningful way, logic, and rhetoric, learning how to turn towards others and persuade them or communicate ideas. Right. Once you've gone through those, then were able to arrive at the quadrivium, four ways, right? With arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These are using, largely, as you see, the language of math and the concept of number and space to apply what they've learned with grammar, logic, and rhetoric in a practical way, learning about the world and the universe around them. The trivium, as we said, was the foundation. The quadrivium was really just for advanced students looking to move on to university. But this is the basic core, and though not many people were involved in the education of a grammar school, nonetheless, these were the most educated people moving forward to run the society in many ways. All right, now progressing into the universities, keep in mind universitas, poorly pronounced right there, sorry, universitas in Latin means all or universal, right? And essentially, you remember what we discussed about guilds. This is a guild of scholars, whether those scholars are the teachers themselves, which is more typical, or, as was the case with some of the earliest universities, actually a guild of students who were responsible for hiring and paying the teachers, and created, therefore, kind of a different model of university in a certain sense, right? They kept teaching the liberal arts, and after the first few years, degrees would be conferred as a bachelor's degree. This is exactly what we would call our first university degrees, by and large, these days. And after a few more years, they'd be able to become a master. That sounds a whole lot like the guilds, right? Learning a trade. So, keep in mind that that's really, the whole medieval mindset is still working off of guild and education as well. But you might not have realized that if you go to get a master's degree today after you've gotten your bachelor's degree with your first 4 years of university. Now, one thing we should keep in mind to fully understand this, those going to university would have been closer to high school age for us, if you want to compare them, right? And so there was a bit of a difference in that sense. And so that explains actually some of the differentiated terms they use in Europe, but we don't need to get added to those details at this point, right? But it's an important thing to see that we really are very much still working off of an educational model that has at least its vocabulary still rooted in the medieval schooling system. Right now, from those 7 liberal arts, they did expand to other fields. The term colleges, as your book mentions, comes from collegium, or the collegia, which is essentially the term that means guild in Latin, and it's used and applied in the medieval context to residence halls for these groups of scholars. This is not, in the American sense, the same equivalent as a university. We tend to use the word college and university as equivalents, and they aren't. At least not their original meanings aren't. Right? There's the cap and gowns, the specialized cap and gowns that were awarded to a master in a field, still exist to this day. If you see graduation ceremonies at many universities, the different professors will have different gowns and different caps that fit their particular field of study. This is the reason why any graduates wear caps and gowns, right? Also, and this is still also largely true, scholars will move from one university to another. It's rare, in fact, these days, and has really all along been kind of rare, to have someone receive all of their education at one university all the way through a doctorate and turn around and teach there. It's much more common to have someone move from one university to another, seeking out specialty fields of study, and perhaps returning or perhaps going and teaching somewhere else, right? Now, this university system is really the key, and in many ways, the key creation of the Western world that has most affected the rest of the world. I mean, certainly we could say that Christianity has done that, but keep in mind, Europe received Christianity from the Near East, right? So that's not exactly a European creation, so to speak. Although Europe did become the center of the Christian world, right? So this creation and this sense of scholarship and kind of independent scholarship with rights of and privileges accorded to them in the terms of a medieval guild, with bulls passed to endorse their scholarship from the papacy, and certain privileges and rights given establishing various universities with royal backing. There was enough independence of mind and independence of action to really create a kind of lasting institution that protected its scholars and protected learning and fostered learning in a way that grew, especially, of course, in the last few centuries. But the roots we owe to the medieval world. Now, over time, it's worth keeping in mind, as your book points out, at least most of these, a lot of these universities did stretch into being known for particular areas of study. First and foremost, for theology was Paris, right? But as your book also mentions, Right? There were some scholars from England studying theology in Paris who had to leave during a war, one of the many wars between France and England. And when they left, they decided to gather together in England and start their own university at Oxford. And so once again, they focused on theology. Now later, a few scholars decided to take off from Oxford because there'd been riots, and in fact, a few scholars that had been killed in these riots, and they went to a different place in England and founded their own university called Cambridge. And those, of course, are some of the oldest universities and the absolute two most famous and universities in England, in the English-speaking world. You also have, you know, universities like Bologna, which is really the oldest, focused on law, Salerno, and also in Italy, focused on medicine, Salamanca, which is the oldest one in Spain, in fact, in the Spanish-speaking world, of course, focused really mostly on law, but on a number of other fields as well. And in fact, one of the first places to really start publicly debating issues of the rights of Native Americans, as well as early concepts of economics before that field was even really created. Right? So it's not mentioned in the text, but it's another pretty important one. All right. One thing that's distinct, of course, is these days most universities would not call theology a science, but science just means a field of study, and they really were the root of, and I mean to say, the famous saying was that theology was the queen of the sciences. That of all the fields of knowledge, the highest one, therefore, is theology, right? And therefore the most prestigious. Right? Now, the next thing our text gets into is a controversy that I don't want to make too much of this, but I wanted to kind of sort of peel it back and help people understand a little bit. I mean, we have this conflict described between Bernard of Clairvaux and Peter Abelard. Bernard versus Abelard. And what is the conflict? Well, I mean, it's described as mysticism, and it is that, versus reason. And I think a clearer term for us ought to be, although it's probably using a later historical word, it's really more an issue of reason as skepticism. Keep in mind, Bernard of Clairvaux was not a professional academic. He was a monk. He lived almost his whole life in his cell. He was very holy, and he had a reputation for being holy, and had a huge amount of influence. He was called upon a number of times to become pope. We've talked about him already. But his primary focus here is God, unsurprisingly. And, his key issue here is that he doesn't trust the world. He doesn't trust the temptations of the world or the vanities of the human intellect, and he's distrustful of relying on limited or fallen human intellects to know the fullest of the truth when the faith is been granted to us by God. So he emphasizes relying on God and focusing on faith rather than simply trusting to our own opinions and our own view of things and our own doubts that may arise. Right? And keep in mind, aspects of the faith, regardless of how much you might dig into them and understand them partially, aspects of the faith are going to remain somehow, in some levels, mysterious, and that's always been affirmed by the church. And so Bernard tends to emphasize that. And when coming into conflict with Peter Abelard, he ends up calling for a council to be able to address some of what Abelard is saying, especially where Abelard is insisting on trusting reason as opposed to faith, reason over and above faith, as a more reliable basis for certain knowledge. Now, modern people look at that and think, oh, really? Well, he's just backwards and he won't think for himself and he just has to blindly have faith. Remember, the subject here actually are points of faith. And so it's not, it's not some imposition to put faith on top of the subject. It's not as if he's, looking to the Bible to find out, some kind of simple or obvious point of biology, right? It's a matter of, keeping things in context and defending the importance of faith as opposed to faulty reasoning, right? Now, Abelard's case, like most scholars, he's training towards being a priest, but it's kind of clear that that's really not his real focus. He's, a famous, really probably more than anything else, for his famous love story with Eloise, who was in her own right a scholar. Notice unusual for the day, but not impossible that you would have a female scholar, right? His most famous work is Ch.10, or meaning yes or no, yes and no rather, and pointing out, notice, inconsistent doctrines. But the key to point out here is why. What's his point in pointing out these doctrines? And rather than clearing them up, which we'll get to in a second, in many ways, his real mode of thought is to look for and exploit and kind of emphasize doubts where possible. Now, his conviction actually is that through doubting, doubting makes you question, questioning makes you reason, and reasoning will help bring you to the truth. But there's a lot of ifs there that may not come true. I mean, a lot of people in their attempt to practice reasoning don't do it exceptionally well, right? So, that's not always going to be the case, and in fact, may not have always that often been the case with him, or many people, right? So, the question arises, can a limited human reason truly be a truly reliable judge over authentic faith? And of course, Bernard is trying to counteract this idea of trusting doubt as opposed to trusting faith, right? And so, through that council, Abelard is condemned on 16 points. He is silenced by the Pope, and he retires to Cluny. And he's not someone that's against the faith, but he's sort of more for his own thought and his own, seeking out sort of it's a little bit sort of like an intellectual itch, someone who's just, insatiably curious and always, and uses doubt as their means. But some of his followers end up doing things like questioning the teaching on transubstantiation. I mean, doubt can be kind of like playing with nitroglycerin in terms of trying to really get to truth in the context of faith. Right now, Gratian's Decretum used reason also, but he did it to clear away confusions with canon laws, and that was quickly embraced. So I mean, this is an age that is enthusiastic about reason. About reason. Don't get the impression that because Abelard was silenced and mysticism from Bernard of Clairvaux was reinforced, that somehow this is an anti-rational period. That's kind of the modern take on Middle Ages as a whole, but it's an ignorant modern take. So don't fall into that. Right? The real problem with Abelard is more doubt than reason, and the way he deals with that. Right now, the real answer comes, and the more foundational thing here from the Middle Ages comes for us with scholasticism, and that is the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas, foundationally. I mean, not Thomas alone. He had a teacher as well, Albertus Magnus, who taught in Cologne and later in Paris, where he taught Thomas. And there are many scholastics that follow in the footsteps of Thomas Aquinas, but he really creates a synthesis here and resolves what appears to be a big fracturing between the faith emphasis of Bernard and the reason, so to speak, emphasis of Abelard, right? In terms of what is the proper pursuit of an intellectual, what is the proper pursuit for the sake of learning. Thomas really kind of brings those together, and he, in the light of his teachers, his thought that the ancients, though they didn't have revelation, they were honoring God themselves by finding wisdom by observing his creation. And particularly he's thinking here about Aristotle. Now, keep in mind, Aristotle had been lost in the West. It had been retained in the East. It had been picked up and copied and worked upon by Islamic scholars, but it had only recently reappeared in the West. And people looked at it sort of suspiciously in the West because it was associated with a lot of the commentary placed on it by Islamic scholarship. So it was a bit of an edgy thing here that Thomas was doing in reviving Aristotle. But he does so masterfully, and he's able to bring together ancient pagan philosophy together with Christian thought, Aristotle together with revelation, reason with faith, the rational with the mystic. And how does he do that? Well, I mean, foundationally, this is essentially the way it works. I mean, as you see here on the right of the screen, that by laying down the principle first that faith is higher than reason, it's more important in the ultimate scheme of things, and it's also simply of a higher order than our reason, right? And so reason can't prove faith, But at the same time, faith is reasonable. In other words, that once that through the faith, one in fact is more able to properly exercise one's rational capacity, which is one of the gifts of God, by the way. Right? So since God is truth, then right reasoning, and that's a key distinction here, not just reason, but correct reason, and authentic faith must ultimately agree because they both come from God. Right? Now, in terms of these terms being and essence that seem to be confusing a lot of people, what's he saying here? Well, being is essentially how I am, right? At the moment, with all my peculiarities and faults and failures, right? My essence is how I'm made to be, who I'm supposed to, you could say, become, right? So through faith, I can learn the difference between those two. But beyond there, by using my reason, I can actually work towards becoming more my essence, both understanding and then, living according to my actual essence, right? And that without faith or without reason, I'm not capable of doing those things, right? Now, the largest, the most foundational work of Thomas's is his Summa Theologica. He wrote more than that, but this is really the main work that people refer to him for. And it's been called, as much of a monument to God, and to, built out of faith and reason as the cathedrals had been out of stone and glass. And really the kind of the primary medieval intellectual achievement. All right. So there's really no way of overestimating the importance of scholasticism and Thomas Aquinas in particular for this whole age. And it's a great achievement. Later, in the Renaissance, it's going to be scoffed at. It's going to be dismissed. People get tired of it. They're going to ridicule this philosophy, and mostly based on sort of some of the smaller points argued by later scholastics. But there's a tendency in history for most people, or many people, to scoff at what immediately came before them and to treat it unfairly. And that happens to scholasticism. But let's not fall into that. It's a great foundational philosophy and a key human achievement. Now, as we move to art, now, interestingly, the title of our chapter calls it art, but it mostly talks about architecture. And you might wonder, why is that? Well, basically, art and architecture were kind of two sides of the same thing. Remember, the only kind of people who had money to pay for art were kings, nobles, and the church. And really, out of all of them, mostly the church. Right? Now, at this point in time, you did have the nobles and the kings paying for a certain number of luxuries, but there wasn't a whole lot of, you could say, kind of high dollar consumer art even. It was mostly for the adornment of the church and the honor of God, right? So when you say art, that might include decorative arts like paintings or sculptures or mosaics or what have you, but it's largely going to be the context of a church or decorating some kind of a monastery, right? Now that we've dealt with that particular question that might have arisen for you, the earlier medieval style, and you could say, as I note down here, in some ways in the West at least, the first really Christian architecture, because keep in mind, they're building off of and using some of the habits of the ancients in making these kinds of buildings, but they're, earlier they more or less copied those styles directly. Here, they've started to adapt it and really create a very Christian designed space out of the old Roman basilica style, but with adaptations, right? And it's called Romanesque, which is a French name. It basically means Roman-like, Romanish. But let's notice the general qualities of this style of architecture, right? Big, it's thick, it's heavy. You've got lots of big solid walls, not very many windows, and the few that you have are small. They do use rounded arches, like the Romans did, right? But they're kind of small. It's almost more like the slits that you would find on the side of a castle out of which you could pour boiling oil or shoot arrows, right? And that's not actually totally an accident. I mean, this style of architecture comes from a time where many times the only buildings around that might be fortifiable if you're under attack are churches, and a lot of times the people paying for churches are nobles, right? So it's and dedicating them or giving them to the church as a gift. It there is an expectation that at times these churches might be used for defense, and so the architecture reflects that from the earlier kind of more violent and chaotic period of transitioning from the fall of Rome into the higher Middle Ages that we're about to reach here, right? In many ways, and in many ways that we are reaching around the year 1200, right? So this earlier style is heavier, and the book, a lot of times people will call it dark and somber and gloomy. I think the better word is somber. It does tend to be dark because it doesn't have a lot of windows, and this is a world that doesn't have electricity, right? So aside from a few candles or lamps at a small scale, you're not going to have a whole lot of light here. It's the earlier period, and it's a transition in many ways out of the classical style of architecture and into what's about to develop, really kind of on the basic bones and the structure lines of the Romanesque, but to a much more decorated and much more refined and beautiful style coming next, and that is the Gothic. Right now, what we see here is a picture of Notre Dame before, sadly, last year, there was a horrible fire in which so much of the cathedral was burned. And immediately, France had started committing itself that they would absolutely rebuild it. And it's kind of hard to imagine Paris without Notre Dame standing as we see it in this older picture. But it's a great example, certainly not the only one, but a great example of a lot of the refinements and a lot of the hallmarks of the Gothic. So what are those? Well, let's note first, Gothic is not what they thought of it as first. And many people simply call it the French style because it did develop in France, not too far outside of Paris, and it spread where French people and French influence spread. But it was called barbaric by Central and Southern Italians who didn't like the Northern style, and they thought, oh, these Northerners, they're just like the Goths from before. And so and these days, when people say Goth, they think dark and spooky, which is a huge historical injustice because this is the brightest style of architecture that had ever existed, and it really ever did exist until lighting came around, and that's only been a little more than 100 years ago. And so, just for the interest of justice, we ought to realize that Goth is a misnomer in the way it's used today. Right? So it's got so many windows that it makes the walls so thin they need extra buttressing. Right? So that's why they come up with this creative solution of the flying buttress. Right? And other key distinctions: it's got pointed arches instead of round ones. Now, to put it simply, I think, well, why? Is that just a stylistic difference? No. Pointed arches transfer vertical weight much more swiftly straight down, right? And it makes them stronger. So a pointed arch is a naturally stronger arch than a rounded arch, which is going to tend to want to break in the middle and not support as much weight. A pointed arch will both go higher, which can look more elegant, and be stronger, right? And they need to maximize strength, considering they're trying to kind of thin the walls out. They're trying to push the walls as far as they can to get as much stained glass in there. And the invention of stained glass really comes around with the Gothic. And, to bring in light, but also the beautiful tones and colors of light, right? Some of them, in fact, organized in these beautiful circular, as they're called, rose windows. Now, of course, at this point, you should, with Avalon in your background, you ought to know that a rose is a symbol of Mary, right? And so these rose windows are very much a symbol of Mary. And remember, this is the Cathedral of Notre Dame, meaning Our Lady, right? And the rose window becomes a key whenever we could afford, in building their cathedral to have a rose window or multiple ones, they would. And it's always a Marian devotion, right? Now, other things you see, ribbed vaulting and fan vaulting. We'll take a look at that in a second. And through the real essential change here that this is a building structure built off of the pointed, not the rounded arch, it makes them very vertical. And this is where we get the idea of tall verticality, as well as expressing that in spires like steeples. All of that really comes out of the Gothic tradition. Right? They don't have steeples, just one of them in the front. They tend to have towers on the front facade and some kind of spire in the middle. Depends on the place you are. Right? So here we have a few smaller spirals as well, spires as well. But that verticality is very much a Gothic trend. Right. Here we have some more. There's so much to see where there's the details of the intricacy of Gothic that I thought we needed a few more images. Here is a rose window from the inside. And that's where you really get the beauty of stained glass. It's when you're on the inside of the building, seeing the natural sunlight pouring through this colored glass and creating beautiful kaleidoscopes. And compared to the somber, darker, more shadowy Romanesque architecture, you have a lot more light. Now, rib vaulting is what you see here. These are like classical vaults, except they're built on the pointed arch, right? And they're reinforced for strength's sake with these ribs, right? And these are constructed ribs of pieces of stone, right? And all throughout, everything's built on not only the arch, but the pointed arch, all for strength, because keep in mind, these roofs are also built out of stone, covered in lead for the sake of weatherproofing. But you have a very, very heavy buildings, right? Now, the facade, and most of these images, in fact, are of Notre Dame still. All right, the left with the rib vaulting is not. Down here, we have fan vaulting. Look at the intricacy of this. It's like lace, right? Lace made out of stone. Highly ornate, lots of very complicated geometry. Of course, gilding as well to make it more beautiful. But it's really astounding to see what they could do with stone. Which we tend to think of big, heavy, blocky, and strong, yes. But here you see this kind of delicacy. It really looks like a lace ceiling. And this was a chapel that was in a certain level dedicated to Mary for what it's worth. This is in Westminster Abbey. Right now, here's the facade of Notre Dame, and notice we see on the front these pointed arches. In fact, it's multiple little pointed arches. Unlike classical architecture that tended to use big single pillars or big single arches, they tend to do multiple nested arches. You can get that better here on this detail. Notice how when you get up close to anything medieval, what seems a little simpler is actually very intricately decorated with all kinds of art crammed into every space. Right? And so it creates a beautiful effect. Right? Over here, you can see what some of the flying buttresses really look like. This is down near the altar end of Notre Dame, and you see this almost like a spider web of flying buttresses coming out to support this wall. And see, it's almost all glass. There's just a few pillars in between that glass, and so they were trying to make sure that with not just flying buttresses, but kind of nested series of flying buttresses. Even up here, you can see that the buttress itself, to make it lighter but still strong, has its own pointed arches in it, which normally in a wall would be a glass window, and it's a beautiful shape. But they're taking away weight and they're keeping strength inside even the arch that is being made into a flying buttress. Right, so a lot of kind of beautiful creativity, but for a structural and practical purpose. Okay, guys. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for us. Sorry, we went a little bit long, but there's a lot to talk about here in Chapter 10. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope you guys have been studying well and keeping up with things. And keep in mind, now that we've wrapped up Chapter 10, we will need to be moving towards a test pretty soon. Don't forget that you're going to have some questions at the end here, and look forward to seeing you later and hopefully seeing you guys in person before the end of the school year. We will talk to you soon. Thanks.